What's up guys, Samson Sound with EDMProd here, and today we're going to be mixing down kick, sub, and mid bass in the style of a driving progressive track by deadmau5 and Atlas. And I'm excited to share this process with you guys. It should hopefully allow you to just open up an old project and get your mixes kind of 80-90% of the way there in 15 minutes or so. Beyond that, if you've not joined our mastermind community, definitely hop in there. There's a ton of producers in there already, a ton of freebies, and it's a really great way to become part of our community and start collaborating with people. All right, let's do it. So the first thing I always do, guys, is load up 1 or 2 reference tracks right at the top of my project. So you see here in the pink, I have Bad at Titles by deadmau5 and Atlas. And the idea is if we can get our mix down sounding as good or better than already released, already fully mastered track, then we know we're in a pretty good spot, right? And so we'll give this a quick little listen. There's a bit of a driving bass line that comes in later in the track. This hot pink here is actually a point in the song that's a couple minutes later, but I've just sort of cut it and put it over here. So nice driving progressive bass line, super clean, super smooth. And so what I'd recommend you do is keep a running list of references. And these are basically tracks that you love. You know, you've heard them a million times. You know that they slap in the car, in the club, in your headphones. Stuff that just as an artist, you really like the sonic quality of it, so that when you go to mix down your track, you have a reference point, right? Because as humans, we have very good relative hearing, but not the best absolute hearing. So we need something that we can A/B to help us make mixing decisions, right? Is my kick as punchy? Does my kick have as much going on in the mids and highs? Do I want it to have maybe more going on in the mids and highs than the reference? You know, it's not about matching it exactly to the reference. It's about having a tool to use to make your mix what you want it to be. So all you have to do to set this up is press Control-K on your keyboard to have your hotkey launcher pop up. And then I'm going to click on the reference volume and press 1. Click on my track and press 1. So now when we want to press spacebar and listen, we can just press 1 on the keyboard to A/B between my track and the reference. So now that we have our project set up, we can listen to our kick and then press 1 and listen to Bad at Titles. And just go back and forth, right? So for the kick drum, the first thing I like to do is kind of just set aside the technical stuff for a second and give my kick a quick honest listen, right? Ask myself, do I actually like this sample? Do I really want this to be, you know, the most commanding, loudest element in my track? Or should I just replace it, right? And a lot of times you will hear some consistency, right, in the type of kicks that artists use. So that's another thing to think about, right? Is this kind of, you know, what I want to say and make a statement as an artist? So I'm going to give it a quick honest solo. Definitely has some potential for this type of track. Needs a little bit of work, but what we'll do now is use the reference to make a couple decisions. So let's get the volume roughly equal to Bad at Titles first of all. I'm going to pull up good old Span, everyone's favorite metering tool. And I'm going to press edit here so you can take a quick look at my settings. I have the average time down to 50 so that the waveform comes through as quick as possible. And I've changed a couple other things here. I'm not going to go into too much depth on it right now, but if you want to save my settings as a preset and compare it with yours, see what you like better, feel free to do that. So we're going to see where Bad at Titles is peaking in the sub region first, right? The frequencies that when you're in the club are hitting you in the chest. We want to make sure we have that nice low end boom. So right about here, I'm not looking over on the right here because this is the volume of the whole track and I'm only focused on the sub frequencies of the kick right now. Now we'll listen to ours and take a look. So we can raise our volume by a little bit. Maybe I'll put it up over here now and we'll A/B. I'll go back down by half a decibel for our kick and we'll A/B again. So we're hitting around the same spot in the sub region now. And we can go on and we can go ahead and, you know, solo this in multi-band. We can solo the lows to listen to just the sub region. So sounding pretty even, right? If you just kind of close your eyes and listen back and forth usually. However, there is a difference right now, trivia. There is a difference still between our kick and theirs. We'll listen through a couple more times. So the volume in the lows is roughly the same, but our kick is ringing out longer, right? It's a little boomier. Theirs is a little tighter. We'll listen once more. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, but keeping in mind that we are going to be adding a rolling sub that's coming off of our kick, it is often a good decision to shorten and tighten your kicks a little bit. A lot of modern kicks are actually really short and punchy. And if you want, you can actually see exactly how long the kick is by just looking at the waveform at batted titles here. You can see if I highlight this area here and then look at the bottom here. Well, when I move my mouse, it's going away. But you can see at the bottom of Ableton at my screen, it's about 176 milliseconds long, right? This nice fat kick waveform. And I'm going to turn off multiband for a second, and we will just Control E and kind of listen to this piece here. We'll listen to the next piece, see if there's any kick in it. Right? So we can be confident that this is pretty much the kick length right here. And so now we will maybe tighten our kick a little bit because ours is ringing out for 410 milliseconds, right? That's going to be kind of long if we're going to have some sub coming here on the offbeats. So let's tighten it up a little bit. That sounds a little better, right? Versus there's also some white noise ringing out at the end of this sample. There's a little bit of recording noise. I'm not exactly sure where this kick came from, but this is sounding a little tighter. And if we listen back to the lows, we're still getting that low end boom in the new one versus the old one. All right, so now let's listen back one more time versus the reference. Okay, the lows are feeling pretty good of the kick. Now what we can do is think about the tonal balance of, the mids and the highs. So we're going to go back to multiband, and I'm just going to solo the mids now. Listen to batted titles first. Sounding pretty even. We'll listen to the highs now. So there's a little more of a click in batted titles. But honestly, I don't love clicks and kicks that much. I find myself usually cutting them out a little bit or taming them. So I'm pretty good with the kick for now. Now, guys, we're on to the good old sub bass. And for sub, it's really more about what is the right sub for my track situationally rather than what is the best sub in the world and how do I get that into my song. So in this case, this sort of driving progressive type bass line, if we just think about the pattern, we have offbeat doubles. And you'll need headphones to hear this, but right now it's just a basic sine wave down in the key of G. It's also pretty common to have just basic offbeat sub. And if we go over to good old span and we think about what's going on, our sub is hitting here, 49 hertz. And so you're going to want to make sure that you have something down in the true sub region, which is roughly 33 to 66 or 67 hertz, essentially C, and then up an octave. And this is going to be the region that, again, makes the ground shake, makes your car shake, and that is true sub. So if you don't have anything in that region, it's going to feel like something's missing from your track. Now, beyond that, if just thinking about the general standards of the genre is always helpful as well. Right? Ours is hitting at, over on the right now, I'm looking at -6. Whereas, in most electronic music, you have your kick pushing the limiter. It's pushing 0 dB, clipping a little bit. For a genre like this, a sub around -6 makes sense. If we're making like bass music or dubstep, it might be up at -4 or maybe even -3 if it was a very aggressive track. And so it's good to stay within the general bounds of your track of your genre, because if you're DJing two tracks that are wildly different, they're just not going to mix into each other at all. So we've got a little offbeat sub. We're going to listen with the kick. Sounding decent. But what we might want to think about is how our sub is going to convert across systems, right? Because this sine wave at 49 hertz is not going to be audible on a laptop speaker or iPhone. So we may want to add some harmonics, right? So if we keep just jamming this through the limiter, that'd be one way to do it. Or we could go right into the operator patch and we could draw them in. You know, we could draw a second harmonic or a third harmonic. And it does change, you know, the tonality of the sub and kind of the character of it as well. So that's something I'm always thinking about, right? Let's go back to just the honest solo. Like, do I actually like this sub? Well, the first thing I noticed is there's a bit of a click in it. So you can get rid of that by either boosting the attack in the synth, or you can just add an EQ and cut it out. So I'm going to cut out the click. And now let's go back into drawing those harmonics, right? Because it did change the character of the sub. And I'm always thinking about, again, like what is the character and the tonality of the sub that I actually want in my track? So I don't mind that second harmonic. So what I'll do sometimes is checkerboard my subs. So I'll just duplicate the channel. I'll have sub 1 and sub 2. And I will just have them alternate patterns. So I'll have a little bit of alternation here. There we go. And so now we have sub 1 and sub 2, which is going to have the second harmonic. Listening with the kick now. So there's a little more groove to our sub now as well versus when we just had one sub. Now we've added a little bit of groove. It's subtle, but it is a nice little touch. And again, always be thinking about how do you want your final mix to convert. So soloing our sub, there's not much going on in the low mids or the range where people are going to be able to hear it across all systems. So you may want to add a parallel layer with some saturation. You may want to add something like erosion, where you can add some redux or some white noise, right? If we add a little bit of now we've got this frequency here playing at the same time as our sub. So always think about the final layers that you want to add to your sub in the mixing and mastering stage as well when you're thinking about how stuff's going to convert across systems. Now we are on to the rolling mid bass line. And I've got a couple of stems here from an old pre-master that I thought would be good for this example. We've got mid bass 1 and mid bass 2. So two similar but slightly different patches, kind of similar to what we did with the sub, together sounding like this. So, again, mixing is 90% leveling, so I'm just going to do the pull up from negative infinity trick first to see where it's sitting in the mix. I'm going to leave it around there for now. And this would be a situation where I would probably reach for something like a glue compressor, two elements existing in the same space that we may want to tie together, make sure the volumes are even and just fatten it a little bit. So when I'm dialing in something like the attack, I kind of like how plucky and the transients of these mid basses. So I don't want to have an attack down here because then I would be compressing it immediately. So I'm going to go for something like a mid-range attack. And we'll just sort of dial this in and see if we can fatten it just a touch and glue it together just a little bit. So I'm going to check the meters now to see what's going on with our headroom. With the compressor off, with it on. So we're peaking at about the same level, but if you listen closely, it is slightly fatter and a little more glued together with the compressor on. Off, on. Now, you see here in the lows, there's something going on down here, so I'm going to cut that out. I know I want that, my kick and sub to exist down there, so I'm just going to add a cut. Now these weird frequencies in the lows are gone. Again, another reason I like to have my meter on the fast setting here that I showed you before. If I go back to default, these lows aren't even showing up here. So now we've cut out the lows. Now, another thing to think about is the width of your mid bass, right? One thing I learned from one of my teachers, Il Gates, is, always think about kind of a Christmas tree of width, starting with your kick and sub. Stuff is in mono. It goes out and gets wider in the mids. Think about those trancy, big, super wide leads. And then it comes back in as you go higher up the frequencies. So let's add a little bit of Serum effects. Really, really love Serum effects for the mixdown stage. Let's add a little bit of Steve Duda's Dimension to add a little bit of width here and see how we're sounding now. Let's open up the Ozone Imager as well so we can see what we've done. So with the Serum FX off, right up the pipe, and with it on, we've widened it a little bit. You could also use something like the Stereoize effect here and add, width to different bands right in Ozone. But we'll keep this off for now. Let's listen again with our kick and sub. Now let's compare it with a reference and see what's going on. I'm going to paste this all over here where I have the deadmau5 rolling bass line. So we're getting there. I wouldn't say we're sounding as good at bad at titles yet, but we're on our way. Now, any final touches we need for our mid bass, you can think about things like using transient shapers if you wanted to add more bite. In this case, I like the way it's cutting through the mix already, so I'm not going to do that. It's also, one of people's favorite things to do, to slap on some OTT. So we'll see how it sounds with OTT. I'm also going to move my glue compressor to the end of the chain so that, stuff is staying consistent as we make these changes. And let's just see how OTT is sounding. That really changes the character of it. It had some weird clicks though, so maybe just a little bit of OTT. Off, on. Okay, so that's pretty good. Now let's tie this all together and take a bit of a bird's eye view here. So we're not even hitting the master limiter yet. That's the first thing. So we'll crank our master gain. I'm going to use the Ableton limiter for this. Generally, I would use something like FabFilter, but we'll kind of just crank it until it sounds super distorted and bad and see what the general bounds of loudness are. So we've added some gain. Our issue now is going to be a tonal balance issue. If we look back at the meters in the sub region, we're peaking way up here. So this is just going to be too much. If we were to get in the car and listen to our sketch at full volume, the lows would just be way too much and we wouldn't even be able to hear any of the mids or highs. So generally, I would go into the individual channels and fix this. I'm just going to add a quick low shelf right now to get us back to even, something like this. And let's just compare the loudness of our track to deadmau5's. So we're right around the same LUFS. And we can be pretty happy with this mix for now. There's definitely some minor tweaks to make. At this point, I will start adding things like subtle EQ boosts or dips on the master change or in the individual channels. On our kick, for example, I think we could probably have a subtle dip right around here. I would probably go into the mid bass, start playing with knobs. Maybe we want slightly more OTT. Just fine tuning it, dialing in the sub, pulling it up from negative infinity, making sure it's sitting to where it feels good to me. Feeling pretty good. Just small 1 dB adjustments all around. Then once you dial that in, you can do one final check of kind of lows, mids, and highs if you want in multiband like we were doing before. We'll compare to deadmau5's track. We'll compare the mids now. And the highs. So we're definitely missing some frequency in the highs. Of course, this is just a sketch of a track we're working with. We don't have any percussion in ours. There's a little bit more going on in the mid range in the deadmau5 track as well. One thing I will do on my master chains is just add a touch of fresh air, so a little bit of soft white noise. But we can be pretty happy with this for now. At this point, I would probably just bounce it out and start listening on different systems. I have kind of my loop that I go through. I'll bounce it out, listen in the car, take some notes, make some changes, go listen on my studio monitors, then go back to headphones, maybe listen on an iPhone, and just kind of keep going in that loop until there's nothing left on your list. Alrighty guys, that's pretty much it for today. Just a couple last things I wanted to mention when we were still in Ableton. If you're having trouble getting the volume of your track to match the reference, it's possible that firstly, your tonal balance might not be dialed in enough, meaning the mix of your lows, mids, and highs. But also, you may need to do more of what we were doing with the mid bass of compressing on a bus or doing things like grouping some drums and using a hard clipper to shave off some peaks so that when you get to the mastering stage, you've saved a little bit of headroom. Also, keep in mind that the reference is just a reference. It's not a hard and fast you need to match it. It's just a launching off point so that you can make decisions for your own mix and artistically, right? And have fun with your own mix. Beyond that, guys, I hope to see you in our mastermind community, and I'll see you at the next tutorial. Peace.